grief, externalized, highly distressed, traumatic grief is hungry, it comes with panic, and it can make you feel like you are crushed under the weight of what is being asked of you.
Grief can be anything, and it can manifest in all sorts of ways that you can't imagine. And it can be incredibly aggressive, it can be incredibly submissive. I'm less perplexed by how varied grief is.
I'm inspired by families who care for children with complex needs or disabilities, by their tenacity and resolve and compassion for their child. That's a living example of humanity.
Hi, this is Connect, Pause and Reflect, CPR for clinicians. In this series, we hear from paediatric clinicians from across Australia who joined us as part of a 4-year research project to share their reflections on the experience of delivering care for complex patients. Our hope is that their shared reflections may help others to feel empowered, more connected, and able to appreciate how they make a difference to patients and families and what sustains them in the many challenges they face. In today's episode on the topic of grief and loss, clinicians reflect on the distress they experience when they feel unable to alleviate the grief and loss families endure. In the second part of this episode, clinicians reflect on the perplexing ways grief and loss may present and the importance of acknowledging clinicians' own grief and vulnerability. The final part of today's episode explores the different ways clinicians find inspiration and how they are able to persist in the face of families' grief and loss.
I think we need to recognise the severe spectrum of grief and loss. As healthcare professionals, we're dealing with loss at different levels. We're having to deal with all those emotions, and that eventually bears down on us and I think contributes to burnout. So it's not only the severe end of the spectrum, it's all the things that we're doing where we're making a difference, but we need to be aware that loss comes in many forms.
What we are really good at in kids is dealing with the loss of parents' expectations for their kids. So it's not about death. Actually, we don't see a lot of death in relative terms. We're not geriatricians. But we actually every day cope with parents and families who are coping with a loss of a different type. And I think it's incredible to watch the people dealing with those scenarios in a different way. One of the things about medicine is, generally speaking, we try and fix problems. And generally speaking, we can't fix this one.
Families that continuously distress me at the moment that we struggle with, where they are grieving and they are in a state of just stagnation in their grief. We cannot seem to move forward, and that's been a constant struggle. And there is this different styles of aggression that come with that you experience in various ways.
So sometimes the distress you get is from feeling that you have to deal with the grief of the family, the quality of life of the child, and that there is no actual pathway that is easily achievable.
For me, I think the biggest, distress is when you know that family so well and you're in the room and you see it hit them. Of course, grief initially, it's not necessarily hitting them in that same way, but then you're there when it does. And, it's a privilege almost to be in the room and to be part of that and to be able to be a very small support for them. But it's distressing. You watch that parent have to blow their dreams from a career point of view. You watch the impact that it's having on the relationship between parents. We see many relationships break down. It's distressing to watch the impact that it's having on siblings.
Doctors always live with fear of inadequacy, fear of doing the wrong thing, fear of complaints, fear of ignorance. But grief and fatigue are really under-recognized. And I've really had to learn to take time for my grief. Don't underestimate the toll it will take on you.
I think things that distress me when I see a family is if I doubt that we could have done it better. So I guess it's not so much about them. It's about when I see something tragic happen, but I know me as a clinician, we as a team, us as a hospital, us as a community have been there every step, then there's a sadness, there's a certain satisfaction that we did it. When I have doubts about that, and it might be that I took too long to get to the diagnosis, that I communicated a bit insufficiently, or whether there's a system issue that meant that family were not looked after the way they should have been. That's, I think, the thing that I find most emotional.
I think one of the really important things is grief becomes incredibly more complex when you're wrong about something, when you've contributed. And there is a real process that you go through. You know, I know that first moment where I realize I've stuffed up, you know, that awful feeling where your heart drops and you realize I got that wrong. And then there's a process where you think through and you sort of evaluate it. Usually I think you're too hard on yourself, but, you know, usually you've done something wrong that's contributed. And then there's the process of actually dealing with it and talking to people about addressing it. And it is an immensely complex thing, to be honest, not to self-serve and to sort of cover up, you know, but also not to be too hard on yourself in terms of the process. They're not perfect. We make mistakes. But I think that really complex mix of grief and guilt and trying to support parents through it is, I think, without doubt, the most complex thing we do in medicine.
I have found when people sometimes come to me gutted about a case, the one thing I can help with is get them to tell me what happened and to quietly analyse it, separating it from the guilt and the failure and the emotion. And in the vast majority of cases, the person did nothing wrong. They were struggling against what was going to happen in the most difficult of circumstances.
Up next, clinicians consider the importance of recognising and acknowledging their own grief when working with families.
Grief, externalized, highly distressed, traumatic grief is hungry, it comes with panic, and it can make you feel like you are crushed under the weight of what is being asked of you. And the complicating factor of all that is when we are also grief-stricken by their story.
Watching somebody grieve and it hurts. It is painful. So to acknowledge the distress and the pain, is to learn to separate their pain from your pain and the need to share it, or it's layer upon layer of unresolved grief. And there are certain deaths that really get to you, aren't there? So to be able, I think that we've got a culture that you have the courage that you can say, I do need extra help this time to get through this. That's certainly been my experience.
I do a lot of work with junior people who are coming back to the workforce, having had children, and we openly acknowledge that that's going to have an impact. They're now seeing grief and loss through the eyes of a parent where they potentially may not have, and acknowledging the impact. And it's almost like you're mentally preparing yourself and normalizing that actually that is going to change their interaction with that family, because they're going to be trying to manage themselves and their own emotions around that situation, as well as trying to support a family.
Identification in some way happens at some level in many deaths, and just to be aware of that is really important. Or if you're going through something, someone is going through a difficult time themselves within their own family or a bereavement, surely that influences certain situations you're in.
For me, what I've seen as being helpful and is where consultants during training were able to show that emotion. And so when someone gives you that opportunity to go, this was really sad, someone just died, everyone just take a few moments just to process or to begin processing that. And I think it's so powerful because sometimes it's just the human aspect of how you're kind of experiencing it. You just think, oh, that's the consultant there. They know what they're doing. They're not experiencing anything like what I'm experiencing here. And yet when you really are able to acknowledge it, I think it's so powerful and helpful.
The family are on an extraordinary journey, the most human journey of all, right? All the mystery and coincidence and serendipity and tragedy and joy of their own lives. And really, I'm almost virtually irrelevant, except as a blip of hope or fear or catastrophe or whatever. And so the journeys, I don't bear the whole responsibility for their journey. I can try and help or coach or mentor or influence. And so recognizing that then I grieve for the things that I see. So sometimes my response is anxiety or fear that I'm inadequate. But really what it is, it's about grief, saying I can't help this. This is a really tough situation and I can only do this about it. And then I have to, just take the time to be respectful of the fact that it's actually very, very sad and challenging for myself.
In the next part of today's episode, clinicians reflect on the many perplexing faces of families' grief when navigating devastating loss.
I think I was always perplexed by grief, but then I think really to rationalize it a bit is that grief can be anything. And it can manifest in all sorts of ways that you can't imagine. And it can be incredibly aggressive. It can be incredibly submissive. I'm less perplexed by how varied grief is.
I don't know if I'm often perplexed in terms of the ways that families grieve their loss. And I think much of that's because everyone grieves so differently. So you just have to expect the unexpected. And everything boils down to if a family member's angry or if they're wanting to come back to the hospital after their child's died, or they're crying, or they're, joking because they don't want to deal with the reality. It all boils down to realizing they're just grieving.
I think grief and loss are such deep and such broad entities that I feel as if, even by trying from personal experience and professional experience, which is a limited experience, there are certain things I understand, but so many situations that I don't understand. But I recognise that it's extremely broad, and I recognise that it does things like it fluctuates, and you can get to a certain point like acceptance, and then you go back, and the family should go down to the park with a kid in the wheelchair, and it's a sunny day, and then the father sees other kids running around playing soccer, and he gets hit like he heard the diagnosis yesterday. I used to feel distress and probably perplexed. I want to take away the pain. I want to help. And then I recognise there's a lot I can't take away. A wise paediatrician said to me, it's not waiting for it to go away, you just wait.
I do often think it's hard For me, it must be 100 times harder for the family. When I have families like that, I do sort of try and put myself in their shoes and think their behaviour is for a reason. They're really just trying to communicate to us their distress, and then maybe not able to articulate it in a particular way, but their behaviour and their control, what we might think is obstructive, is actually their way of communicating their distress.
I was constantly confused by the way that very externalized grief becomes hyper-focused on very small elements of care or story that people become fixated on that are trivial, don't matter to us. So I was very confused about that, but it's their grief. Grief is infinite. You can get lost in the pool of their grief. And I find that very upsetting and stressful.
For the last 9 years working with social workers, what I've realised is that the way that people react to news very much depends on their pre-morbid personality or their pre-morbid functioning. And so what I would like to teach the juniors, I suppose, to understand the way they are acting here is because of all these things that happened up until that moment. And you may not be aware of all these things that have been happening here. So I think understanding that pre-morbid functioning really, really helps. I don't find much perplexing now. I used to, but not anymore, because I think there's a whole raft of ways that people can respond and behave to the news that you give them, which has all started back here.
I just want to highlight that sometimes complaint represents a concentration of negative energy and grief. Sometimes you find you go to touch that single item and then suddenly out of it, this nuclear force of grief. And it's just...
It's been helpful for me to reflect about how painful the bargaining or inquiry aspect of grief and loss is for families. I understand that the features that arise from grief are recognised as being universal across cultures, and that all human hearts go through these phases along the journey of loss. I think that the nature of the mind is to solve problems, and this is when thoughts like I should have, I could have, if only I could have done more, these can run over and over again in an out of control sort of loop. And we can get really caught up looking for solutions. And this loop of inquiry seems to happen so often in grief and loss. And if it's not recognised, it can be really tricky.
We've talked about the child and the family as though they're one coherent and they're all in the same place at the same time. Whereas my reality is very different from that. And, in general, I used to see more of the mothers than the fathers, and I was much more attuned to where the mothers were up to. And then when the father would come in, suddenly you're on different planets. And working through the issues of how to deal with child, siblings, mother, father, all at totally different stages of a journey. I mean, that's a challenge.
I think about the perplexed and the distress and the inspiring, and I think, as I think about it more and more, that in every grief situation, all of those elements are there all together. I think the perplexing is very common because the depth of feeling is so strong. It's hard to come to greater love than a parent for a child. And yet that's so aligned with anger and helplessness, paralysis, etc. When it falls apart and families disintegrate, that is very distressing. I think that stress is part of every child we look after.
Probably the thing that perplexes me the most about this is how many families deal with such grace. I know it's a cliche, but people love their children, adore their kids, and we hurt when they're hurt, and we want them to grow and be independent, and So when I see these parents deal with such profound, devastating, cruel, unfair losses and hurt all the time, I actually feel kind of perplexed how often they show up, how often they cope, how often they accept things that should be unacceptable, and how they dig so deep. That perplexes me. I often find myself thinking, I don't know that I would manage as well as you're managing in this situation.
In the final part of today's podcast, clinicians reflect on what inspires them in the face of grief and loss. They acknowledge how inspiring families' acceptance of grief and loss is, and how families' continued enjoyment of their child and compassion for one another provides further inspiration.
I'm inspired by families who care for children with complex needs or disabilities, by their tenacity and resolve and compassion for their child. That's a living example of humanity.
And the thing that inspires me is probably just that often the compassion that families show for each other.
Grace and inspiration. It doesn't sit alone. I am inspired every day by the families I work with, so it doesn't sit alone.
Of being inspired, and I can give many examples of where people have moved on to another page and enjoyed the child while they have them.
I'm very inspired by families who can hold their grief without ignoring it or wishing it away. They just walk with their grief, and it's always there in the room. It's very okay to acknowledge it.
There are a lot of situations where I'm involved in grief, and sometimes the information is very clear. I know that somebody has a very definitive problem and they have a very clear course. But a lot of the time it isn't clear. And, a lot of it is you have an idea about a potential problem, but you really don't know exactly what it's going to mean. And so, I guess a lot of the time is spent sort of feeling very humble about trying to know the accuracy of what you're saying, what you're going to tell people is likely to happen. And in terms of then what that leads to, I'm always amazed by families' capacity to adapt, that, you give them sometimes a very bad prognosis and you just gradually see families readapting their expectations, what they expect for their child. And with time, families meet a new equilibrium. They get a different balance. Their life course is different. Their family life has changed considerably. But it's not always a terrible life. In fact, often it isn't, and often they're getting joy at things they would never have been able to anticipate they'd get joy in terms of their kids' achievement. And I love that. I find it just remarkable. And I think one of the privileges for me as neurologist is to actually be part of that and to share in that pleasure, because it is at times just truly remarkable.
I think too that you can make a difference, and to truly believe that. The times the families might have come back and said years later when you've forgotten, but you played with the sibling the night before he died and I had time to spend with the child dying. Those things, that it's not just the medical model, but it's about connecting and compassion. There's something very privileged about sharing such intimate kind of love and grief, and I think that can be strengthening.
I think acceptance implies that this loss is okay with me, but real acceptance is much more about integrating it into the fabric of who we are and our stories. And I think when we as clinicians walk with families as they live this reality of anguish and sadness, this often enables the families to hold all of it, the beautiful and the terrible. And I think it's inspiring when we see families arrive at this point. Finally, clinicians reflect on the extraordinary love, resilience, and capacity to advocate for others that families demonstrate in the face of devastating loss.
In terms of what I become inspired by as such when I think about these families and their grief, I think, their ability to always see and find hope, no matter how small it is, their ability to advocate for small and big things for both the child and the family. And then beyond that, they set up organisations whose entire purpose is to advocate for this rare condition or situation that they're in. And often beyond their own child's life, they're keen to continue to advocate to improve systems and, the delivery of care for other people who might be going through similar situations. I'm inspired by their ability to advocate, on personal levels with the NDIS, saying this is what I want, and to be able to articulate what matters most to them.
To have a family who loved their daughter so much they didn't want to put her through what could have been a hopeless treatment, that is inspirational to me. But to be honest, the oncologist would have done whatever the family wanted. If they wanted to go through with the treatment, they would have done that too. So it is pretty inspirational for these people. And I also have her picture up on my desk all the time, and the last painting that she made. And I look at her and I think, wow, she's such an incredible little girl, even though she's only 3.
Some families never want to walk inside the hospital again, and other families want to, and you will see them put their hand up to be a part of a consumer committee or volunteer. And we know now the lived experience is so incredibly valuable, and that, I suppose, inspires me incredibly when I see a mother who is able to come back. And there's an extraordinary loss of purpose when you lose a child who has had high needs. That space in your day, what do you put inside of that, and what do you do with those skills? And I know I was, as a junior nurse, extremely suspicious of that kind of behaviour. And in fact, now I think they're probably the wisest people we have in our space, because they survived and they have found value, and they've been able to validate their child and be these extraordinary advocates in the face of debilitating distress.
That concludes today's episode on what distresses, perplexes, and inspires clinicians when navigating grief and loss. If you're interested in learning more about the research project behind these podcasts, or about hosting Connect, Pause and Reflect sessions in your workplace, further resources are available on the Sydney Children's Hospitals Network website. We would like to acknowledge the ClinEquip steering group led by Professor Annie Bai, including Fleur Leman, Professor Kenneth Nunn, Suzanne Nevin, Erin Beavis, Rachel McLaughlin, Rebecca McIntosh, Doctors Rani Sachdev and Elizabeth Palmer, and the ClinEquip advisory group who contributed to the co-design of these resources. We thank the Manildra Group for philanthropic funding. Thank you for listening.